In the third week of March, 1843, in a drafty reading room on the second floor of the Royal Institute of British Architects in London, a junior surveyor named Edmund Carver unrolled a set of architectural drawings across a long oak table. He felt the first cold pull of something he could not name. The gas lamp above him hissed softly. Rain pressed against the tall windows in steady rhythmic waves. The drawings before him were undated. No preliminary sketches accompanied them. No margin calculations, no crossed-out measurements, no corrections in a second hand. None of the ordinary evidence of design in progress. The proportions were exact, as if transferred from a finished building rather than imagined toward one. Carver noted in his private journal, a small green cloth volume that survived in a Bristol estate sale in 1971, that the drawings resembled not the conception of something new, but the record of something already standing. The building they described had not yet been erected, but nothing about the drawings suggested it had ever been in doubt. This is the peculiarity that sits at the center of Victorian architecture, and it has never been fully resolved. In the early 1840s, an entire architectural vocabulary arrived with a completeness that the historical record struggles to explain. The steep gabled rooflines, the decorative bargeboards with their intricate wooden lacework, the asymmetrical towers, the wraparound verandas, the polychrome brickwork, all of it appeared in a span of a few years as finished language, not a dialect under development, not a style struggling toward itself, fully formed, deeply detailed, technically complex. The accepted history of architectural development requires decades of experimentation, of failed attempts, of visible iteration. In the case of Victorian architecture, that record is, at best, incomplete. At worst, it is missing. On the 14th of June, 1841, the Illustrated London News published its first issue. Among its early pages were engravings of new country houses being constructed across Surrey and Kent. Architectural historians have returned to these images repeatedly, and the observation that emerges is consistent. The buildings depicted do not look new, they look established. The ornamental details in the engravings, the turned wooden posts, the decorative ridge tiles, the quatrefoil window glazing, are rendered not with the tentativeness of experimentation, but with the confidence of convention. Yet these same details had not appeared in British domestic architecture in any significant form even 15 years earlier. The Georgian terraces of the 1820s show none of it. The Regency villas of the 1830s show almost none of it. And then, with a suddenness that the record does not account for, it is simply there. A Georgian street photographed in 1835 shows flat facades, regular fenestration, restrained stone detail, nothing excessive. Then a photograph taken in the same city in 1848, and an entirely different visual world has arrived. Towers with decorative spires, gabled dormers, bay windows projecting from facades, cast iron railings with botanical motifs, chimney stacks grouped and corbelled. The contrast is not one of gradual change. It reads, visually, as rupture. In September of 1847, the builder and contractor James Kellaway submitted an invoice to the Lichfield Diocese for construction work, completed on a parish rectory in Staffordshire. The invoice survives in the diocesan archive, its edges brown and brittle now, the ink faded to the color of weak tea. What survives alongside it, filed in the same envelope and seemingly never noticed until an archivist cataloged the collection in 1988, is a materials list. And on that list, appearing without explanation alongside the expected items, dressed stone, lime mortar, seasoned timber, are 14 references to components described simply as per type. No dimensions follow, no descriptions, no source. Guess the archivist's penciled note in the margin reads, recurring entry. No original specification found in collection. As per type. The phrase implies reference to a standard. It implies that the components being ordered were already known, already cataloged, already reproducible from an existing model. In 1847, for a rural parish rectory in Staffordshire. The question the phrase raises is a simple one. What was the type and where did it come from? The conventional account of Victorian architecture traces its origins to the Gothic revival, generally situated in the late 18th century, through the work of Horace Walpole at Strawberry Hill and the theoretical writings of Augustus Pugin. Yet the line of influence runs from picturesque romanticism through Pugin's moral architecture, His insistence that Gothic form was not merely aesthetic, but spiritually correct. It arrives at the great buildings of the 1840s and beyond. The Palace of Westminster, begun in earnest from 1840 under Charles Barry and Pugin himself. It's the wave of church restorations and new ecclesiastical buildings that followed. It is a coherent narrative. It has named figures and traceable ideas. But it does not fully account for the speed. Pugin published his enormously influential work, Contrasts, in 1836. In it, as he argued, with architectural drawings he himself prepared, that medieval building represented a moral and spiritual superiority over contemporary construction. The book caused a significant stir. It was reprinted. It was argued over. But between 1836 and 1840, 4 years, an entire industry does not typically reorganize itself. Craftsmen do not retrain. And new tools are not manufactured. New supply chains for decorative terracotta, for encaustic floor tiles, for cast iron architectural components. These do not materialize from a single polemical text in 4 years. They require infrastructure. They require investment. They require, in other words, preparation that predates the publication date. On the 3rd of November, 1852, in a warehouse district east of Bristol's floating harbor, a fire destroyed a storage facility belonging to a building supply merchant named Hartfield and Sons. A brief notice appeared in the Bristol Mercury 2 days later, noting the destruction of pattern books, trade catalogs, and the merchant's private stock records going back to the founding of the firm. Yet the founding of Hartfield and Sons, according to a surviving trade directory from 1839, was 1821. 30 years of records, gone. A warehouse fire in 1852 is not inherently suspicious, but it is one instance among many. Yet the years between roughly 1838 and 1858, precisely the period in which Victorian architectural conventions consolidated themselves, are characterized across multiple trades and archives by an unusual density of lost documentation, records destroyed, businesses reorganized under new names, correspondence collections with significant gaps. Yes, pattern books that later historians cite as foundational, but which exist now only in secondary references, the originals unlocated. A marginal note in the papers of the architect William Butterfield, held at the Architectural Association and dated by hand to approximately 1849, reads, "The forms do not require invention, only application." It is an odd formulation for a practicing architect in the middle of a period of supposedly explosive stylistic innovation. It does not read as a man discovering new formal possibilities. It reads as a man working from a pre-existing grammar. The Palace of Westminster, which became the defining symbol of Victorian Gothic, is typically described as a new building on an ancient site. The rebuilt Parliament following the catastrophic fire of 1834. Charles Barry won the design competition in 1836. Construction proceeded through the 1840s and 1850s. But the timeline of its construction conceals something the popular account tends to elide. By the time Barry won the competition, many of the building's most distinctive decorative systems, the carved stonework, the patterned encaustic tiling, the wrought iron grillwork, already required craftsmen with highly specialized skills. Where were those craftsmen trained? Under what system? On which prior buildings? On the 7th of April, 1839, a journeyman carver named Thomas Renwick wrote a letter to his brother in Leeds, describing his work on an unspecified large commission in Westminster. The letter is held in a private collection and was first cited in a specialist journal in 2003. Renwick writes, in his cramped and nearly illegible hand, that the patterns he is cutting come from the book, not from the head. The book is old, he says, and was not made for this work. But the patterns fit. Then an old book, not made for the work at hand, but whose patterns fit the new building with enough fidelity to be used directly. The letter does not name the book. No inventory of Renwick's tools or possessions appears to survive. The phrase from the book appears in at least 3 other contexts in the 1840s, both in tradesmen's letters and workshop notes from different cities. In each case, no book is identified. In each case, the reference implies not discovery, but consultation, the checking of an existing resource rather than the invention of a new solution. Architectural historians have generally read these as references to published pattern books of the period, of which there were many. But the published pattern books of the 1830s and 1840s, when examined closely, present their own puzzle. They are themselves remarkably complete. They do not show the development of their own conventions. They arrive, like the buildings, already finished. In October of 1844, in Edinburgh, and a young architect's apprentice named Alexander Findlay wrote in his training journal, which survives complete in the National Library of Scotland, that his master had asked him to copy from the originals in the office, not from any printed version. Findlay does not specify what the originals were, nor their age, nor their provenance, but his phrasing is careful. Printed versions existed. Yes, the originals were distinct from them. The originals were in the office. This is not a remarkable observation, until it is placed beside the absence of any clear record of what those originals might have been, where they come from, or who produced them. A wide shot now. The industrial infrastructure of Victorian architectural production. By 1845, and firms across the Midlands were producing encaustic tiles in quantities that implied established market demand. The Minton factory at Stoke-on-Trent, often credited with reviving the medieval technique of encaustic tile production, was operating at a scale that suggests not the early stages of a revival, but the response to existing appetite. The technical knowledge required to produce encaustic tiles, the layering of differently colored clays, now the control of firing temperatures, the cutting of relief patterns in the bisque, is not trivial. It cannot be improvised quickly. Herbert Minton himself, in correspondence held at the Potteries Museum, refers in 1842 to the methods as if describing an inherited practice rather than a recovered one. By the 3rd of September, 1850, the firm of Minton and Company had supplied encaustic tiles to over 40 ecclesiastical buildings. The tiles displayed in those buildings, seen now in floor patterns in surviving Victorian churches from Cornwall to Northumberland, are not experimental. They are not the products of a craft in its early iterations. The grout lines are precise. The color registration is consistent. As the geometric interlocking patterns are mathematically correct, they are the products of a process fully understood and fully controlled in 1850, in a craft supposedly revived within the previous decade. The rain, in London, in November of 1853, fell on a city already entirely Victorian in its new buildings. Was the transformation had happened with a speed that contemporaries did not remark on, with the surprise one might expect, which is itself strange. When a new style consolidates itself over decades, it is experienced as change. When it arrives quickly, it tends to be experienced as arrival, as if it were always coming, as if it were somehow inevitable. Yet the Victorian architectural language was, by the early 1850s, already being described by critics not as innovation, but as restoration. Not the creation of something new, but the recovery of something old. The language of recovery is important. It implies that the thing being recovered was always there, waiting. Augustus Pugin died in September of 1852, at the age of 40, having produced an almost impossible quantity of architectural drawings, decorative designs, and polemical texts in a career of barely 20 years. The sheer volume of his output, detailed drawings for hundreds of buildings, decorative systems for textiles, metalwork, ceramics, stained glass, has occasionally prompted comment. His biographers have noted his extraordinary capacity for work, his short sleep, his manic energy. The drawings themselves, examined closely, display a fluency that is difficult to attribute entirely to individual genius. The details are not exploratory. The lines do not double back. The proportions are resolved from the first mark. Ish close-up, a page from a Pugin sketchbook held at the Victoria and Albert Museum, showing a decorative arch with intertwined botanical carving. The pencil lines are single and certain. There is no overworking. There are no alternatives tested in the margins. The design is given, not arrived at. In 1855, 3 years after Pugin's death, so his former draftsman, a man named Sebastian Doyle, gave a brief interview to a Dublin architectural journal. The interview is quoted in a 1932 monograph on Pugin and has not been widely discussed since. Doyle is reported to have said that Pugin often worked from sources not in general circulation, sources he did not speak of, except to say they were accurate. The monograph's author dismisses the comment as the vague reminiscence of an old man. But Doyle was 53 in 1855, not elderly, and the word he reportedly used was accurate, not beautiful, not traditional, accurate, sources that are accurate, sources not in general circulation. Yet the question of where Victorian architecture's founding vocabulary came from is not answered by the names of the men who deployed it. It is answered, if it can be answered, by tracing the sources those men consulted. And those sources are, with a consistency that accumulates into something more than coincidence, either absent, unnamed, or described in terms that suggest they predate the period in which the style supposedly originated. A medium shot, the interior of a Victorian church. Any one of the hundreds constructed between 1840 and 1870. The stone ribs curve overhead toward a central ridge. Carved foliate capitals sit atop polished stone columns. Its encaustic tiles map out geometric patterns across the nave floor. The stained glass throws colored light in rhomboid patches that shift across the pews as the sun moves. This is not a space produced by improvisation. The proportions governing the nave's width-to-height ratio, the column spacing, the relationship between the clerestory windows and the floor level, these are precise. Yet they produce specific acoustic effects. The reverberation in such a space behaves in ways that architects in the 1840s did not have the acoustic theory to fully predict. Yet the spaces perform as if they were designed with that knowledge. In 1861, a German acoustician named Hermann von Helmholtz published his foundational work on the sensations of tone, establishing the modern understanding of resonance and acoustic behavior in enclosed spaces. His work postdates the construction of hundreds of Victorian churches whose acoustic properties align, with a regularity that acoustic engineers have noted in modern studies, with principles that Helmholtz would later formalize. The buildings were not designed using Helmholtz's theories, and Helmholtz's theories had not yet been written. Yet the buildings behave as if someone understood them. A 2007 acoustic survey of 14 Victorian Gothic churches in the north of England, conducted by researchers at the University of Leeds, found that 11 of the 14 displayed what the researchers termed anomalous consistency in their reverberation profiles, a phrase meaning that the acoustic properties of the spaces were more similar to each other than the variation in their physical dimensions would predict. The buildings were designed by different architects in different decades, for different parishes, using locally sourced materials from different quarries. They should sound different. They sound, in measurable ways, remarkably alike. Yet the survey noted without elaboration that the consistency suggested a common source of acoustic intention. The researchers did not pursue this observation. Their paper was about measurement, not history. But the phrase sits in the literature like an unanswered question. A common source, not common knowledge, is not common practice as it had been publicly transmitted, but a common source, something upstream of the individual buildings, organizing their properties before the first stone was laid. On the 22nd of September, 2019, a preservation architect named Claire Hedden stands in the nave of a small Victorian church in rural Shropshire, holding a laser measuring device that emits a soft electronic click with each reading. The church was built in 1858 by an unknown architect. The commission records were lost when the local vestry was reorganized in the 1920s. The building is structurally sound. It has been in continuous use for over 160 years. Hedden has been called in to assess it for a heritage listing application. Her job today is simply to record dimensions. She works methodically, from west door to east window, from floor to ridge beam. At one point she pauses, studying the reading on her device's small screen. She takes the measurement again. Then a third time. The width-to-height ratio of the nave, she will note in her report, it is 1 to 2.618. This ratio, known in mathematics as the product of the golden ratio squared, recurs in Gothic architecture from the medieval cathedrals of France. It appears in Chartres. It appears in the nave of Lincoln Cathedral, built in the 13th century. And it appears here in this small, forgotten, architect-unknown Shropshire church from 1858. With a precision her laser confirms to within 3 millimeters. Hedden includes the observation in her heritage report as a supporting argument for the building's architectural significance. She does not speculate about its source. Yet the question of how a Victorian country church, built by an unnamed architect, achieved a mathematical precision associated with the great medieval workshops does not fall within the scope of a heritage listing application. It remains in her report as a data point, noted, measured, and unexplained. The window of a moving train, in the autumn of any year in the 1850s, would have offered a landscape punctuated with spires. The Victorian building program was vast. Between 1840 and 1900, an estimated 7,000 new Anglican churches were constructed in England alone, alongside tens of thousands of other Victorian buildings, railway stations, civic halls, country houses, rectories, schools, hospitals. The scale of the project required industrial coordination. In standardized components, trained labor forces, shared design systems, and that coordination requires, at its foundation, a shared vocabulary, agreed-upon forms, proportions, details that can be communicated from architect to builder to craftsman without ambiguity. That vocabulary was in place, operational and complete, by 1840, before the industry that relied on it had fully organized itself. Before the theoretical framework justifying it had been published, before the training schools that would teach it had opened. The South Kensington Museum, later the Victoria and Albert, opened its architectural collection to study in the 1850s. Among the items acquired in its early years was a set of medieval architectural drawings of uncertain provenance, catalogued simply as continental, all probable date 14th to 15th century. A footnote in the acquisition register, in a different hand and ink from the main entry, adds, several details correspond closely to current practice. Current practice in the 1850s, meaning Victorian Gothic. Several details in documents described as 500 years old, corresponding closely to what Victorian architects were building. The acquisition register sits in the museum's archive. The drawings it references are catalogued and can be examined by appointment. Side by side, the medieval drawings and the Victorian working drawings do display correspondences, in proportion, in the handling of decorative foliate carving, in the geometry of window tracery. The Victorian drawings do not copy the medieval ones precisely. Yes, they resemble them in the way that two documents produced from the same source resemble each other. Not identical, but organized by the same underlying logic. History has a conventional way of accounting for this. Revival. The Victorians revived Gothic. They studied medieval buildings. Yet they copied what they found. The revival hypothesis is coherent and supported by the writings of Pugin and his contemporaries, who were explicit about their intentions. But revival implies a gap in time during which the knowledge was absent, during which practitioners would need to rediscover, reconstruct, and test. Revival is labor. It is imperfect at first and refined through practice. What the Victorian record actually shows is something closer to retrieval, immediate, fluent, technically precise, and unaccompanied by the visible effort of rediscovery. Today, the computational tools used in contemporary architectural practice, parametric modeling software, digital fabrication, the algorithmic proportion systems are sometimes traced in the academic literature to a revival of interest in what practitioners call generative geometry. Mathematical proportion systems of medieval origin that can produce complex architectural forms from a small set of initial rules. The language used in this literature is itself interesting. The systems are described not as inventions, but as rediscoveries. If the rules are described as having been latent, the forms are described as having been waiting. Papers published between 2015 and 2023 on generative Gothic geometry occasionally reproduce diagrams that bear a close resemblance, stripped of their historical framing, to the working drawings of Victorian architects. The underlying geometry is the same, yet the rules that produce the forms are the same. In the contemporary literature, they are credited to medieval sources. In the Victorian buildings, they appear without attribution. In March of 2022, a researcher at a European university studying the geometry of Victorian ecclesiastical architecture published a short paper noting that a set of proportion rules recoverable from careful measurement of Victorian Gothic buildings could be encoded in a sequence of 7 geometric operations. Operations that a trained draftsman could apply and without knowing their mathematical basis, following only the physical steps of compass and straight edge. As the paper suggested that such a sequence, if transmitted as practical instruction rather than theoretical knowledge, could produce architecturally consistent results across many practitioners working independently. It would not require that each architect understand the proportional system. It would require only that each architect follow the steps. And the paper ends with a question that its author does not answer: where the sequence was first recorded, and whether that record still exists. The official record of Victorian architecture is vast and well studied. The buildings stand, the drawings survive in archives, the names of the great architects are known. But underneath that record, in the margins of invoices and the brief lines of craftsmen's letters, in the unexplained consistencies of acoustic measurement and the silent precision of proportion ratios, something moves that is harder to name, not fraud, not conspiracy. Something more like inheritance, the transmission of knowledge through channels that the formal record does not fully describe, arriving in the 1840s with a completeness that the years before it cannot account for. Edmund Carver, in his green cloth journal, returned to those undated drawings 3 times over the following months. His final note on them, yet written in the spring of 1844, is brief. The drawings had been claimed by another surveyor and removed from the reading room. Carver had not learned their origin. He wrote only, "The question is not who drew them, but from what they were drawn." He underlined the last phrase once in a heavier hand, as if returning to the sentence after setting down his pen. Yet the question remains. The buildings stand. The rain continues, falling on their stone eaves and running in thin streams down their carved facades, finding the same channels it has always found, as if the stone already knew where water would go.